An employee trembled upon seeing a portrait and, unable to contain herself, said, "Sir, your mother is alive. I saw her in the asylum where I worked." And from that moment, the millionaire's life changed forever. Before starting the story, comment from where you're watching us. I hope you enjoy this story. Don't forget to subscribe. The notes from the grand piano resonated, creating a dense atmosphere. Maurice Belmont, with his gaze on the ivory keys, let his fingers move by inertia while his mind wandered through hazy memories of a past he believed buried forever under layers of pain and resignation. Rose, the new employee who had arrived a few weeks ago with impeccable recommendations, entered the room with a distraught face and her hands clutching a cleaning cloth as if it were her only anchor to sanity in that crucial instant. Her steps stopped abruptly near the piano, interrupting the melody. Maurice lifted his gaze slowly, with the tired eyes of a man who has carried an internal mourning for too many years, and met the tearful and terrified look of the woman standing before him, visibly trembling. "Mr. Maurice, forgive my boldness and my lack of control, but there's something that God won't let me keep silent about any longer, or my soul will be condemned forever in the hell of cowards," exclaimed Rose, with a voice broken by sobs she tried to repress without success in front of her employer. Maurice stood up slowly, feeling the tension in the room rise until it became almost unbreathable, and gestured softly with his hand for her to calm down so he could understand her rushed words. "Your mother, Mrs. Mary Belmont. She's not resting in peace as everyone in this house and in this city blindly believes for so long," Rose blurted out suddenly, feeling the words burn her throat as they came out. Maurice felt a sharp blow in his stomach, a mix of confusion and offense, for the memory of his mother was sacred, and he wouldn't allow anyone to play with it in such a cruel way. "What are you talking about, woman?" "My mother passed away 6 years ago. I was at her wake myself," Maurice replied with a grave voice, trying to impose order amid the emotional chaos. "No, sir. I swear on the lives of my children and the memory of my ancestors that your mother is alive, breathing, and suffering in this same world that has forgotten her," Rose insisted, taking a step forward, ignoring the social barriers that separated her from the mansion's owner. "I saw her with my own eyes, touched her, combed her hair, and heard her prayers every night in the place where I worked before coming to serve in this house." Maurice stepped back, lightly bumping against the piano's wood, feeling the polished marble floor shift under his feet as if an invisible earthquake were shaking his reality. The conviction in Rose's eyes was absolute. There was no trace of madness or malice, only a genuine desperation to be believed and to release a truth that tormented her. "Where do you say you saw her? How dare you say such a barbarity without proof?" questioned Maurice, feeling the air escape him and his heart beginning to pound painfully against his ribs. "In the asylum, sir, at Street, Michael's Angel Clinic, that horrible place where they lock people away so the world forgets they exist," Rose replied quickly, releasing the name of the cursed place she had kept in her memory. "I worked there cleaning the rooms of the forgotten patients, and she was in the room at the end of the hallway, always looking out the window, waiting for you to come get her." Maurice felt a buzzing in his ears. The clinic's name was painfully familiar, as it was the same place where his mother had supposedly spent her last days receiving treatment. "She prayed your name every night, Mr. Maurice," she said. Her son played the piano like the angels, and that one day he would come to take her out of that unjust confinement. Rose's words were like precise daggers stabbing into Maurice's most painful memories, awakening doubts he had numbed with alcohol and excessive work. At that precise instant, the sound of heels clicking with a paced and elegant rhythm on the main staircase broke the intimacy of the confession and brought a new energy to the room. Karen Torres Belmont, Maurice's wife, descended wearing an impeccable white dress that contrasted with the darkness of the rainy afternoon, enveloped in a cloud of expensive and cloying perfume. Her presence always imposed a reverential silence in the house, but this time her eyes scrutinized the scene with predatory sharpness, instantly detecting that something out of the ordinary was happening in her living room. "What's all this commotion, dear? I can hear shouts all the way upstairs, and you know how much I detest unnecessary noise," said Karen with a sweet and rehearsed voice, though her eyes shot warning darts at the crying employee. Maurice didn't respond immediately. He kept looking at Rose, trying to process the impossible information he had just received and comparing it to the official version of events. Rose, far from being intimidated by the lady of the house's presence, felt rage giving her a new surge of courage upon seeing the woman she knew deep down was responsible for everything. "I was telling Mr. Maurice that his mother is alive, Mrs. Karen, that Mrs. Mary didn't die that night as you told the whole world," clarified Rose, facing the lady of the house with a firmness that surprised even Maurice. Karen's face, usually a perfect mask of serenity and control, showed a micro-expression of panic that lasted barely a fraction of a second before being replaced by a grimace of indignation and mockery. "But what insolence is this, Maurice? Are you going to allow this servant woman to disrespect us by inventing macabre stories about your poor mother?" exclaimed Karen, approaching her husband and taking his arm with a possessiveness that sought to remind him to whom he owed loyalty. "It's not an invention, ma'am. It's the truth I saw with my eyes and heard with my ears during the months I worked in that hell of a clinic," retorted Rose without lowering her gaze, knowing this was the all-or-nothing moment. "Mrs. Mary has the same gold necklace that's in that portrait over the piano. She never took it off because she said it was her son's last gift." Maurice turned his head sharply toward the oil portrait presiding over the living room, where his mother smiled with the peace he missed so much. And indeed, the painted necklace was unmistakable. That necklace disappeared the day we committed her. "The doctor said it got lost in the transfer," murmured Maurice, feeling a puzzle piece starting to fit in a way that chilled his blood. Karen gripped her husband's arm tighter, digging her perfectly manicured nails into his jacket fabric, trying to pull him back into her web of control and psychological manipulation. "Please, Maurice, don't be ridiculous. This woman just wants money or attention. It's typical of uneducated people to invent dramas to profit from decent families," hissed Karen with contempt, trying to discredit the witness before her words took deep root. But Maurice gently freed himself from his wife's grasp and stepped toward Rose, looking at her with an intensity seeking any trace of lie in her gestures or trembling voice. "What else did she tell you? If it's true you spoke to her, tell me something only my mother could know, something no one else in the world knows," demanded Maurice with a hoarse voice, desperate for proof to confirm or dismiss the madness. Rose wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a deep breath, searching her memory for the whispered conversations in the darkness of room 217. "She told me about the lullaby, sir, the one she sang to you when you had nightmares as a child and couldn't sleep because of fear of the dark," Rose began to recount softly. "She said the lyrics were about a silver boat sailing through the clouds, and the captain was you, searching for stars to give her." Maurice felt his knees buckle and had to lean on the piano to avoid falling, for that song was an intimate secret between mother and son that he had never shared with anyone, not even Karen. Tears began to well in the man's eyes, breaking the barrier of coldness he had built over years to survive his mother's absence. Karen observed her husband's reaction and knew the ground was becoming dangerous, so she decided to change tactics from indignation to false medical concern. "Darling, you're very upset. This woman is manipulating you emotionally, using coincidences and cheap assumptions to hurt you," intervened Karen with a honeyed voice, trying to physically interpose herself between Maurice and Rose to break the connection that had formed. "That doctor is a demon, sir. He knew perfectly well your mother was sane and took envelopes of money to keep her locked up and silent," shouted Rose, pointing accusingly at nothing, as if the doctor were present in the room. Maurice raised his hand, demanding absolute silence. His mind was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions, but doubt had installed itself irreversibly in his heart. "Enough, both of you. I need silence to think and process all this happening in my own home," ordered Maurice, with an authority he hadn't exercised in a long time, surprising Karen, who retreated, offended. "Rose, go to your room and don't come out until I call you. I don't want you talking about this with anyone else in the staff." The employee nodded humbly, knowing she had planted the seed of truth and that now it depended on the employer's conscience whether that seed germinated or died. Karen tried to protest, arguing she should fire her immediately, but an icy look from Maurice stopped her cold, freezing the words on her red-painted lips. When Rose left the room, silence fell over the living room again. But this time it wasn't a peaceful silence, but one loaded with suspicions and unanswered questions. Maurice turned to his wife, observing her as if she were a stranger, noticing for the first time the rigidity of her posture and the barely disguised fear in her clear eyes. "Why didn't Dr. Villalobos ever let me see my mother's body before the burial, Karen?" asked Maurice with a terrifying calm that made his wife swallow hard. "You know why, honey," It was for your own good. The heart attack had left her in bad shape, and he wanted you to remember her as she was in life. Beautiful and serene, she replied, reciting the excuse that had worked for years. But this time the words sounded hollow, false, like a lead coin falling on a glass table, revealing its lack of value. Maurice walked to the window and looked at the rain, remembering the phrase Rose had mentioned about the silver boat and the clouds. My mother always said lies have short legs and that truth, though late, always comes to collect its debt with interest, murmured Maurice to himself, feeling anger begin to replace sadness inside him. Karen approached cautiously from behind and placed her hands on her husband's shoulders, trying to give a relaxing massage that in the past always worked to dispel his doubts. Are you stressed from work, my love? Tomorrow all this will seem like a ridiculous nightmare caused by a resentful employee, she whispered near his ear. Maurice tensed at the touch, feeling a physical repulsion he had never experienced before toward the woman he shared his life and bed with. He pulled away abruptly and walked toward the living room exit, leaving Karen alone with her reflection in the mirror and the growing fear that her empire of lies was about to collapse. That night, the Belmont mansion sank into a restless darkness where no one could find true sleep, each trapped in their own thoughts and fears. Maurice locked himself in his study, surrounded by old photo albums and legal documents, searching for any inconsistency he had overlooked in his grief. Karen, in her bedroom, made frantic calls in a low voice, biting her nails and pacing like a caged animal sensing danger. Rose prayed in her small staff room, clutching a worn rosary in her hands, asking God to give Mr. Maurice strength to face what was coming. And outside, the rain continued falling, washing the outer world, while inside the house, the moral dirt began to surface. Maurice found in a forgotten drawer an old journal of his mother's, where she noted her thoughts and concerns before being committed, and he began reading avidly for clues. The trembling letters on the last pages spoke of fear, of feeling watched in her own home, and of the distrust caused by her son's new wife. She looks at me as if I were an obstacle to be eliminated, and I fear my son is too blinded by love to see it, Maurice read aloud, feeling tears roll down his cheeks as he recognized his mother's handwriting. Doubt turned to certainty, and certainty to an imperative need for action to discover what had really happened behind those clinic walls. Meanwhile, Karen burned papers in her bedroom fireplace, watching the flames consume receipts and notes that could incriminate her if anyone decided to investigate deeply. Her face, illuminated by the fire, showed no remorse, but a cold determination to protect her status and comfort at any price, even if it meant destroying whoever crossed her path. She didn't know fate had already rolled the dice and the game had changed, turning her from the master player into the prey of her own actions. The dawn arrived slow and grey, finding Maurice dressed and ready to leave with a steely determination shining in his red eyes from insomnia. He wouldn't rest until he found the truth, even if that truth shattered everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his own identity as a son. The story of the tragedy had begun long before that rainy night, in the sunny days when the Belmont mansion still echoed with genuine laughter and the benevolent authority of Mrs. Mary. She had built the family empire alongside her late husband, brick by brick, and ruled her home with a mix of firmness and unconditional love that kept the family united. Maurice was her pride, an educated and sensitive man who had inherited her talent for business, but also her soft heart, a quality Mary feared would be his downfall. Karen Torres's arrival in Maurice's life was like a cold wind entering through a poorly closed window, subtle at first but capable of freezing the entire atmosphere over time. Karen, from a once wealthy family fallen on hard times, saw in Maurice not just a husband, but the master key to reclaim the social and economic status she believed she deserved by birthright. From the first day Karen stepped into the mansion as Maurice's fiancée, a silent and undeclared war was established between her and the family matriarch, camouflaged under polite smiles and empty compliments. Mary, with her intuition sharpened by years, immediately perceived the unchecked ambition in her future daughter-in-law's eyes and the lack of genuine warmth in her gestures toward Maurice. That woman loves you, son, but she loves herself and what you represent more. Mary had warned him one afternoon in the garden while pruning the roses. Maurice, blinded by infatuation and Karen's dazzling beauty, dismissed his mother's concerns as natural jealousy of someone fearing displacement in her son's heart. The wedding was celebrated with over-the-top opulence, organized almost entirely by Karen, who ensured every detail screamed money and power to the four winds. Once installed in the house as Mrs. Belmont, Karen began a systematic and slow campaign to isolate Maurice from his mother's influence, using emotional manipulation as her main weapon. She subtly complained that Mary was meddlesome, that she criticized her way of dressing or running the house, always playing the victim in her husband's eyes. "I just want us to be a modern family, Maurice. But your mother clings to old customs and makes me feel this will never be my home," Karen would cry in the bedroom's intimacy. Maurice, caught between love for his mother and the desire to please his wife, began yielding ground, asking Mary to be more flexible and gradually withdraw from household decisions. Mary, out of love for her son and to avoid greater conflicts, accepted stepping back, unaware that each concession was another nail in her own coffin. The situation worsened dramatically when Valerie was born, the first and only granddaughter, for Mary poured all her love into the girl, awakening sickly jealousy in Karen. The grandmother spent hours singing to the baby, teaching her to pray and telling family stories, creating a bond that Karen felt as a direct threat to her maternal authority. "I don't want her filling her with those old ideas, Maurice. Your mother is obsessed with the girl and doesn't leave me space to be a mother," argued Karen, beginning to insinuate that the elderly woman was losing touch with reality. It was then that small household accidents began appearing, which Karen attributed to Mary's carelessness, like leaving the gas on or doors unlocked. In reality, it was Karen herself orchestrating these incidents, moving objects or turning off lights to confuse her mother-in-law and then accuse her of senility in front of Maurice. Mary, though older, was perfectly lucid and realized the traps her daughter-in-law set, but every time she tried to defend herself, she sounded paranoid to her son's ears. "Maurice, I didn't leave that stove on. I swear I turned it off after making tea," Mary would say with anguish, seeing doubt grow in her son's gaze. "Mum, maybe you forgot. It's normal at your age to have lapses, don't worry," he would reply condescendingly, repeating the words Karen whispered to him at night. Mary's frustration grew day by day, seeing her word lose value against her daughter-in-law's perfectly constructed lies, feeling increasingly cornered in her own home. Karen took advantage of every family dinner to highlight Mary's supposed mistakes, looking at her with false compassion that humiliated the elderly woman more than any direct insult. The final blow in this phase of Karen's plan was introducing Dr. Ernest Villalobos into the family circle, presented as a casual friend and medical eminence. Villalobos was an ambitious and unscrupulous man, with gambling debts that made him vulnerable and willing to sell his professional ethics to the highest bidder. Karen met him at a charity event and quickly identified him as the perfect accomplice for her plan to get rid of the annoying old woman without dirtying her hands directly. "My mother-in-law is very ill, doctor. We need a discreet professional opinion to help my husband accept reality," Karen told him in their first private meeting, slipping a thick envelope into the doctor's pocket. Villalobos got the message instantly and began visiting the mansion frequently, observing Mary with clinical eyes and noting non-existent symptoms in his leather notebook. Villalobos earned Maurice's trust, showing himself compassionate and concerned, using complex medical terms to explain normal aging behaviors as signs of severe dementia. "Maurice, your mother's brain is deteriorating faster than we thought. These forgetfulnesses are just the tip of the iceberg of a neurodegenerative condition," the doctor sentenced one afternoon in the study. Maurice, scared and without medical knowledge to refute the diagnosis, began seeing his mother not as the strong woman who raised him, but as a fragile patient needing constant supervision. Mary tried to talk to her son alone, warn him about the strange alliance between his wife and the doctor, but her words were interpreted as typical persecution delusions of her illness. Mary's loneliness became absolute in her own home, surrounded by servants who dared not speak and a family that looked at her with pity or contempt. Karen began restricting Mary's access to little Valerie, claiming the elderly woman could be dangerous to the girl in a moment of mental confusion. This broke Mary's heart, who spent afternoons crying in her room, hearing her granddaughter's laughter in the garden without being able to approach. "It's for safety, Mum. Understand you're not well," Maurice would say with a broken heart, repeating the script Karen and Villalobos had written for him. The elderly woman took refuge in prayer and the piano, playing sad melodies that echoed through the house like a ghostly lament that deeply irritated Karen. That noise is going to drive me crazy, Maurice. You have to do something. We can't live in a constant funeral, complained Karen, pressing for the next step in her macabre plan. One night, Karen staged the definitive incident, breaking a valuable vase in the living room and scratching her arm, screaming to wake the whole house. When Maurice came running, he found Karen crying on the floor and Mary standing nearby, confused by the noise and scene. She attacked me, Maurice. Your mother attacked me because she says I stole her house, screamed Karen, pointing accusingly at the elderly woman who looked at her with horror and disbelief. I didn't do anything, son. I came down because I heard a noise. She was already on the floor, defended Mary, but the circumstantial evidence and Karen's acting were too convincing. Maurice, horrified and believing his mother had lost total control, made the decision that would mark his life with eternal guilt. They called Dr. Villalobos immediately, who arrived with a private ambulance and a pre-prepared commitment order, as if he had been waiting for the call. It's an aggressive psychotic break, Maurice. It's no longer safe for her to be at home. She needs containment and specialized treatment, affirmed the doctor, while two nurses held Mary. The elderly woman didn't scream or fight physically. She just looked her son in the eyes with such deep disappointment that it chilled his soul. Don't let them take me, my son. I'm not crazy. It's her who's lying, whispered Mary as they took her out of the house she had built herself. Maurice stood at the door, hugging a falsely sobbing Karen to his chest, watching the ambulance lights take his mother into the darkness. That night the mansion fell into sepulchral silence, broken only by the sound of starting rain, foreshadowing years of sadness. Karen poured herself a glass of wine in the kitchen, smiling for the first time in months, feeling finally the sole owner and lady of everything around her. She didn't know a mother's love is a force that transcends walls, false diagnoses, and even apparent death. Maurice went up to his mother's now empty room and sat on her bed, smelling the faint perfume still impregnating the pillows, feeling the first twinge of a doubt that would take years to bloom. Thus began Mary's exile and Karen's reign of psychological terror, built on the most painful betrayal a son can commit against his mother. The old staff was gradually dismissed in the following weeks, replaced by new personnel who didn't know the history nor had loyalty to the matriarch. Karen wanted to erase any trace of Mary, redecorating the house, changing furniture, and storing the portraits in the dark and dusty attic. But the house had memory, and every corner, every creak of wood, and every ray of light remembered the woman who had been unjustly expelled. Meanwhile, at St. Michael's Angel Clinic, Mary awoke in a white and bare room, understanding her struggle had just begun and her faith would be her only weapon. The transfer to St. Michael's Angel Clinic was the start of a bureaucratic and medical nightmare, meticulously designed to strip Mrs. Mary of her identity and human dignity. Dr. Villalobos had prepared the ground with falsified reports describing a highly unstable, aggressive patient with advanced dementia, justifying total isolation. At the clinic reception, Mary was stripped of her personal clothes, her wedding ring, and any object connecting her to her previous life, left only with a rough grey gown. It's for your safety, Mrs. Belmont. Here we're all equal, a stone-faced nurse told her while storing her belongings in a black plastic bag. Mary tried to maintain composure, standing as tall as she was, showing they could take her jewels but not her innate nobility. Maurice visited the clinic a week after admission, anxious to see his mother and ensure she was getting the best care as Villalobos had promised. However, the encounter was carefully orchestrated by the doctor and Karen to be an emotional disaster, confirming the false diagnosis. Before the visit, Villalobos ordered a high dose of potent sedatives for Mary, leaving her in a state of lethargy and confusion, babbling incoherent words. When Maurice entered the room, he saw his mother with a vacant stare, slightly drooling and not recognizing him instantly, which broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. "Mom, it's me, Maurice. I've come to see you," he said, taking her limp hand, hoping to see the usual sparkle in her intelligent eyes. Mary, fighting against the chemical fog clouding her mind, managed to focus on her son and tried to speak, but her tongue felt heavy and clumsy in her mouth. "Get me out, trap," she managed to articulate with titanic effort, but to Maurice they were just guttural sounds and senseless phrases. Villalobos, present in the room like a sinister guardian, placed a compassionate hand on Maurice's shoulder and shook his head sadly. "I'm so sorry, Maurice. The disease is advancing fast. Her mind is very deteriorated, and sometimes reality mixes with her paranoid hallucinations, explained the doctor softly. Maurice left the room crying, convinced his mother was no longer there, that only an empty shell remained, making it easy for Karen to convince him not to visit so often to avoid unnecessary suffering. Over the months, Maurice's visits became more sporadic, always manipulated by Karen, who invented social commitments or work crises to keep him away from the clinic. Meanwhile, Mary learned to pretend to take the pills, hiding them under her tongue to spit them out later when nurses weren't looking, gradually recovering her lucidity. As her mind cleared, she understood the magnitude of the conspiracy against her and realized screaming or rebelling would only increase her dose or strap her to the bed. She decided to adopt a strategy of silence and observation, becoming the model patient, calm and cooperative, while analyzing the place's routines for a crack to escape or communicate through. She discovered Villalobos not only had her unjustly detained, but other patients whose families paid to keep them hidden from the world. Karen, meanwhile, consolidated her power in the mansion and family bank accounts, using Maurice's signature to divert funds supposedly for Mary's care. She paid exorbitant sums to the clinic, but much of that money returned to Villalobos's in her own pockets through shell companies. It was a perfect business: get rid of her mother-in-law and enrich herself at the expense of the old woman's illness, all under her depressed husband's nose. The few times Maurice asked about expenses, Karen showed inflated medical bills and reminded him, "For your mother, the best no matter the cost." Maurice's guilt was the fuel keeping the whole machinery of lies running, and Karen knew exactly how to stoke that fire when it threatened to die out. At the clinic, Mary began writing desperate letters on toilet paper scraps or napkins she managed to steal, addressed to her son, old friends, anyone who could help. She tried bribing a cleaning assistant to smuggle out a letter, but the employee, fearful of losing his job or worse, delivered the note straight to Villalobos. The punishment was severe. Mary was moved to a windowless isolation room for a week in complete darkness to reflect on her manipulative behavior. In that darkness, Mary was close to breaking, but the image of her son and granddaughter Valerie gave her strength to keep breathing and resisting the madness threatening to devour her. "I won't give them the satisfaction of truly driving me mad. I'll get out of here and show them who Mary Belmont is," she promised herself in her cell's solitude. It was after that isolation when Rose started working at the clinic, a young but good-hearted woman needing money to support her family. Rose was assigned to the difficult patients wing, where Mary was, and from the first day noticed something different about the elderly woman in room 217. Unlike other patients who screamed or stared blankly, Mary greeted her politely with a dignity that didn't match her clinical history of severe dementia. "Good morning, dear. Thanks for cleaning my room." "It must be hard work," Mary said one morning, surprising Rose with her voice's clarity and gaze. Little by little, between sweeps and sheet changes, a silent complicity wove between the two women, based on mutual respect and Rose's intuition that something was wrong. Mary, cautiously, began telling Rose bits of her life, about her pianist son, her rose garden, the betrayal that brought her there, testing the young woman's loyalty. Rose listened, fascinated and horrified, realizing the woman spoke with total coherence and her stories matched high society news she sometimes read in old magazines. "You're not crazy, Mrs. Mary, you're saner than many doctors working here," Rose whispered one day, sealing a pact of trust. Mary cried for the first time in months at feeling validated, knowing someone else saw the reality and not the lie built by Villalobos. She asked Rose not to do anything risky yet, to wait for the right moment, for she knew Villalobos was dangerous and had eyes everywhere. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Karen was growing impatient with the situation, as keeping Mary alive, though locked away, was still a latent risk and ongoing expense. In a secret meeting with Villalobos at a discreet coffee shop in the city, she raised the need for a final solution to close the chapter forever. "How much longer will this last, Ernest? Maurice keeps asking when he can visit her again, and I'm running out of excuses," said Karen, tapping the table impatiently. Villalobos, greedy but cowardly at the idea of direct murder, proposed an alternative plan: fake Mary's death and transfer her to an even more remote and cheap place. "We can say she died of a heart attack, give a fake body or close the casket, and I'll handle moving her to a clandestine residence in the countryside where no one will look for her," suggested the doctor with a malevolent smile. Karen accepted the plan with chilling coldness, seeing in that proposal the definitive liberation from her ghost and total consolidation of her victory. She returned home that night and hugged Maurice with feigned tenderness, psychologically preparing him for the inevitable news soon to come. "Your mother has been very weak lately, love. We have to be prepared for anything," she said while stroking his hair, sowing resignation in his heart. Maurice, exhausted and sad, nodded without suspecting he was sleeping with the enemy and that his mother's civil death sentence had just been signed. The conspiracy of silence closed like a noose around the Belmonts' necks, tightening until it suffocated the truth. The day chosen for the plan's execution approached, and at the clinic, Mary felt an inexplicable unease, a dark premonition that made her skin crawl. She gave Rose her most precious possession, which she had managed to hide in a mattress hole, the nacre rosary Maurice had given her as a child. "Keep it, dear, and if something happens to me one day or they take me from here, find my son and give it to him. He'll know what it means," she entrusted urgently. Rose hid the rosary in her uniform, promising to fulfill the mission, unaware destiny would test her much sooner than imagined. The perfect storm of lies was about to explode, and only a cleaning employee's fragile promise remained as hope against absolute darkness. St. Michael's Angel Clinic was an old brutalist architecture building with grey concrete walls that seemed to absorb the little sunlight, daring to touch its rough, cold surfaces. Inside, the atmosphere was an oppressive mix of industrial disinfectant smells, overcooked food, and the subtle but unmistakable odor of accumulated human despair over decades. For Mrs. Mary, accustomed to her home's warmth full of wood, velvet, and fresh flowers, this sterile environment was constant sensory torture aimed at breaking her spirit. Her days were measured not by hours but by nurse shifts and the medicine cart's arrival, a monotonous routine designed to nullify the will. Despite everything, Mary maintained iron discipline. She got up, washed with the sink's cold water, and prayed the rosary using her fingers to count the Hail Marys, since the physical one she had given to Rose. Her room, number 217, was a white cube with a small barred window overlooking a cement inner courtyard where nothing green grew, only weeds in the cracks. From there, Mary watched the sky, her only fragment of freedom left, and spoke to the clouds, imagining they carried her messages to her son's window. "Don't forget me, Maurice. I'm still here. I'm still your mother," she whispered to the wind, fighting the insidious voice of depression telling her she had already been forgotten. Loneliness was her constant companion, interrupted only by Rose's brief visits, who had become her only link to humanity and sanity. Rose entered with her cleaning cart and, while pretending to mop the floor, whispered news from the outside world, brought smuggled sweets, or simply held her hand with affection. "Today the day is beautiful outside, Mrs. Mary. The trees are blooming, and people are out without coats," Rose would tell, painting landscapes with words that the elderly woman could no longer see. Those small conversations were the oxygen keeping Mary alive, reminding her there was a world beyond the clinic walls, and it was worth waiting. However, Dr. Villalobos began suspecting the closeness between the patient and the employee, noticing Mary seemed more animated after Rose's cleaning shifts. He ordered more frequent hallway surveillance and changed Rose's schedules to coincide less with Mary's lucid moments, trying to cut that dangerous bond. One night, the fake death plan was set in motion with surgical and cruel precision, taking advantage of an electrical storm battering the city and covering any suspicious noise. 2 burly nurses entered Mary's room past midnight. They woke her abruptly and injected a potent sedative without explanation. "It's time to go, ma'am. We're transferring you to a better place," one said sarcastically while lifting her onto a stretcher, tying her wrists and ankles with leather straps. Mary, semi-conscious but terrified, tried to scream her son's name, but only a choked moan came out before darkness engulfed her completely. They took her out the back service door under torrential rain and put her in a black unmarked van waiting with the engine running. The next morning, chaos reigned in the wing where Rose worked. Nurses whispered in corners, and there was an atmosphere of secrecy and nervousness thick enough to cut with a knife. When Rose tried to enter to clean room 217, she found the door locked and a supervisor blocking her way sternly. "No need to clean there, Vargas. Patient Belmont passed away last night from a massive heart attack," the supervisor informed coldly, without eye contact. Rose felt the ground open under her feet. The water bucket slipped from her hands and crashed, spilling soapy liquid all over the hallway. It can't be. Yesterday she was perfectly fine. I talked to her, and she was strong, exclaimed Rose, forgetting her position for a moment and the danger of questioning authority. Shut up and clean this mess. If you want to keep your job, old people die. That's life, snapped the supervisor, threatening with an accusatory finger before walking away, clacking her heels down the hallway. Rose, trembling and crying silently, picked up the disorder, but her heart screamed it was a lie, that Mrs. Mary hadn't died, that they had taken her. That same afternoon, determined to find answers, Rose sneaked to the administration office during shift change and overheard a conversation through the half-open door. It was Dr. Villalobos's unmistakable voice on the phone. Yes, everything went perfect. Mrs. Belmont, the package is on its way to Street Lucia. No one suspects anything. Yes, the death certificate is already signed. Upon hearing that, Rose had to cover her mouth to not scream in horror. Her worst suspicions confirmed. Mrs. Mary had been kidnapped and erased from the map with her own daughter-in-law's complicity. She knew staying there was dangerous, that if they discovered what she knew, she could suffer a fatal accident. But she also knew she couldn't abandon her friend to fate. She decided to quit that day, alleging urgent family problems to move freely and find a way to reach Maurice Belmont. She left St. Michael's Angel Clinic, with the nacre rosary pressed against her chest, swearing before the grey facade that she would return for justice. Meanwhile, the black van transported Mary kilometers away to a rural and isolated area on the outskirts of a quiet California town where Street Lucia residence was located. This place wasn't a clinic, but a dump for unwanted people. An old, crumbling house hidden among eucalyptus trees, operated by unlicensed people without scruples. Upon waking, Mary found herself in an even smaller and damper room, with mold stains on the ceiling and rusted bars on the only window. A burly, rough-looking woman entered to see her. "Welcome to your new home, Grandma. Here, no questions and no bothering. If you behave, you'll eat. If not, you'll go hungry." Mary understood with terror she had descended another step into hell, but inside her, a flame of indignation ignited stronger than ever. At St. Michael's Angel Clinic, Dr. Villalobos meticulously erased Mary's record, destroying nursing notes and altering logs so everything matched the official version of natural death. He felt untouchable, a god deciding who lived and died socially, backed by Karen Torres's inexhaustible money. He didn't count on a simple cleaner's loyalty and a mother's love being forces that couldn't be quantified or controlled with bribes or threats. The clinic returned to its routine of silence and sedatives, swallowing other forgotten ones' screams. But the ghost of the injustice against Mary remained impregnated in the walls. Rose, now outside the system, began her own investigation, discreetly asking around, saving newspaper clippings about Mary's death, and observing the Belmont mansion from afar. She knew she couldn't just ring the bell and tell her story without proof. They would take her for crazy or an extortionist, and she'd end up in jail. She needed a plan. She needed to get into the house, earn Maurice's trust, and find the precise moment to strike the blow to the lie. Years of waiting passed, working in other houses, saving, and praying. But never, not one day, did Rose forget the promise made in room 217. Mary, in her confinement at Street Lucia, aged physically. Her hair turned completely white, and her skin wrinkled like parchment. But her mind stayed sharp, praying and remembering every detail of her previous life. She clung to the memory of her son's piano music, humming the melodies softly to not forget who she was and where she came from. "I am Mary Belmont, mother of Maurice, grandmother of Valerie, and I am alive," she repeated like a mantra every morning upon opening her eyes. The corrupt system's cold embrace hadn't managed to freeze her heart, which kept beating to the rhythm of a stubborn and indestructible hope. The morning Maurice received the call announcing his mother's death, the sun shone with cruel irony over the California hills, illuminating a day that for him would turn into his soul's darkest night. Dr. Villalobos's voice on the other end sounded professional and falsely contrite, reciting words he had rehearsed in the mirror. "I'm deeply sorry. Maurice, we did everything possible." But her heart simply stopped while she slept. Maurice felt the receiver weigh a ton, and the doctor's words reach his brain delayed, muffled by a layer of disbelief and sharp pain. He hung up without saying goodbye and stared into space, feeling a fundamental part of his existence tear away and fall into the abyss. Karen appeared on the scene with the perfect timing of a consummate actress, already dressed in a black silk robe, as if she had anticipated the morning, or perhaps simply because black suited her figure well. "What happened, love? You're pale as paper," she asked with feigned concern, approaching to hug him before he could even articulate the news. "She's gone, Karen. My mother died alone in that horrible place, and I wasn't there to hold her hand," sobbed Maurice, collapsing into his wife's arms, seeking comfort from the same person who had caused his misfortune. Karen hid a triumphant smile on her husband's shoulder, stroking his back and whispering empty words of consolation. She finally rested. "My life. She was suffering a lot. Now she's in a better place and watches over us from heaven." The funeral organization was a whirlwind of quick decisions taken by Karen, who handled everything to ensure no one asked the wrong questions or tried to see the body. She claimed that due to strong medications and elapsed time, Dr. Villalobos strongly recommended a closed casket funeral to preserve Mrs. Mary's dignified image. Maurice, sunk in paralyzing depression, nodded to everything, unable to fight or think clearly, blindly trusting his wife's and the friendly doctor's judgment. The mansion filled with white flower wreaths, high society friends coming to fulfill protocol, and hypocritical murmurs about what a good woman the deceased had been. On the wake day, the main living room turned into a funeral chapel, with the polished mahogany casket in the center, surrounded by flickering candles casting dancing shadows on the walls. Maurice stayed seated in front of the coffin for hours, touching the cold wood, silently asking forgiveness for abandoning her, for not being the strong son she deserved. "Forgive me, Mum. Forgive me for not bringing you home," he repeated in a constant whisper, torturing himself with the guilt Karen had so carefully cultivated in him. Inside the coffin there was no body, just sandbags and stones of equivalent weight, a macabre mockery that went unnoticed before the mourner's teary eyes. Karen received guests with somber elegance, accepting condolences and praising her husband's strength, perfectly playing the stoic widow and family support. It was a blessing, really. Her mind wasn't here anymore, she commented to curious friends while having coffee and cookies in the adjacent room, rewriting Mary's history to her convenience. No one suspected the monstrous truth hiding behind the facade of respectable grief. Society preferred to believe in illness and natural death rather than imagine such a vile conspiracy. Valerie, then only 3 years old, didn't understand why her grandmother was in that wooden box and why her dad cried so much, but she felt the old woman's absence like a cold hole in her small world. The burial in the family cemetery was quick and grey, under an overcast sky that seemed to share Maurice's sadness, closing the cycle of the lie with the last shovelful of earth on the empty grave. Maurice stood before the marble headstone reading, "Here rests Mary Belmont, beloved mother," feeling he was burying his music and joy of living with her. Returning to the mansion was even worse, for the house's silence was no longer of waiting but of definitive absence. Every corner screamed the name of the matriarch, who would never return. Karen, anxious to turn the page, began suggesting changes in the house almost immediately. "We should paint the study, remove those old curtains, give it a new air so we're not sad." Maurice reacted with unusual fury to these suggestions, strictly forbidding touching any of his mother's belongings for now, clinging to the objects as if they were talismans. He took refuge in alcohol and work, spending long hours in his office or in front of the piano without playing a single key, turned into a ghost in his own life. The relationship with Karen cooled even more. Though she had control, she didn't have her husband's love or respect, who unconsciously associated her with pain and loss. Karen, frustrated because Mary's death hadn't brought the instant happiness she expected, began traveling alone, spending the family fortune on clothes and jewelry to fill her inner void. Years passed, dragging that toxic dynamic. Valerie grew up in a house where her grandmother's name was mentioned little and always with a tone of forbidden sadness. The sensitive and intelligent girl noticed the tension between her parents and the shadow always seeming to cover her father, developing an innate curiosity about that mysterious grandmother figure. Maurice aged prematurely. Grey hairs and wrinkles marked by a furrowed brow appeared, losing the artistic shine he once had. However, deep in his heart, something didn't quite fit. A visceral feeling that his mother's end hadn't been right, an unease that didn't let him rest in peace. Meanwhile, at Street Lucia residence, Mary survived against all odds, nourished by memories and the stubborn hope her son would come. She had lost exact track of time but marked seasons by temperature changes in her cell and the light entering the window. She didn't know her son brought flowers to an empty grave every Sunday, nor that her daughter-in-law spent her inheritance in Paris or Milan. She lived in a limbo of suspended existence, legally dead to the world and a prisoner to the real one. Karen's lie seemed perfect and indestructible, shielded by official certificates and time's passage that erases suspicions. But lies, no matter how well built, are like houses of cards, needing only a breath of wind in the right direction to collapse. And that wind was already blowing, slowly approaching in the form of a former cleaning employee who never forgot a promise and a curious girl about to climb to the attic. The grief built on lies was about to face the most alive truth ever. 6 years had passed since the fake funeral, and the Belmont mansion had changed superficially, modernized to Karen's cold and minimalist taste, losing much of its original classic charm. However, there were forbidden and forgotten zones in the house, accumulating dust and secrets, like the large attic on the upper floor that no one ever went up to. Valerie, now a vivacious and curious 9-year-old, felt an irresistible attraction to those unexplored corners, seeking adventures to escape the rigid and silent atmosphere her mother imposed. One rainy afternoon, similar to the one when it all began, Valerie took advantage of her mother being at the social club and her father at the office to sneak upstairs to the attic. The attic smelled of old wood, mothballs, and stopped time. Light filtered through a dirty skylight, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air like tiny golden fairies. Valerie began exploring among cardboard boxes, old travel trunks, and furniture covered with white sheets that seemed like static ghosts waiting to be awakened. In a corner, behind an old coat rack, she found a large painting turned to the wall, as if punished or hidden in shame. With effort, the girl turned the heavy golden frame and found herself before the painted face of a beautiful elderly woman, with kind eyes that seemed to look straight into her soul, and a smile that felt strangely familiar. "How pretty you are," whispered Valerie, running her small fingers over the oil texture, feeling an immediate and inexplicable connection with the woman in the portrait. It was Mrs. Mary, painted in her best years, wearing the famous gold necklace and seated with elegance and power, radiating a warmth missing from the rest of the house. Valerie brought down the painting carefully and sat in front of it, inventing stories about who that mysterious queen might be, unaware she was contemplating her own blood. At that moment, she heard hurried steps on the stairs. It was Karen, who had returned early and was searching for her daughter impatiently. Karen entered the attic and stopped short seeing the scene, her daughter sitting before the forbidden portrait of her mother-in-law, as if the ghost had returned to claim her place. Color drained from Karen's face, and an irrational fury took over, born from deep fear that the past would be unearthed. "Valerie, what are you doing touching that old junk? I've told you 1,000 times not to come up here," shouted Karen, advancing toward the girl and snatching the painting violently. Valerie got scared and backed away, not understanding why her mother reacted with such hate to a simple, pretty painting. "I was just playing, Mom." She was smiling at me. "Who is she? She looks like Dad?" asked Valerie innocently, throwing a truth that hit Karen like a slap. "She's no one. A distant relative who died long ago. A bad and crazy woman we don't talk about," lied Karen with a trembling voice, trying to put the painting back against the wall and cover it with an old blanket. "Go down to your room right now and wash your hands. You're covered in dust," she ordered, gently pushing the girl toward the exit. Valerie obeyed, but took with her the image etched in her memory and the feeling her mother was hiding something important about that bad woman. That same night, Maurice came home more tired than usual and noticed a strange atmosphere. Valerie was quiet during dinner, and Karen drank more wine than normal, with a nervous gaze. "What's going on? You're very quiet today," commented Maurice, trying to break the ice without much success. "Your daughter, insisting on rummaging through trash in the attic, found that old painting of your mother and I had to scold her," blurted Karen, trying to minimize the fact but watching her husband's reaction. Maurice paused with the fork halfway to his mouth, feeling a pang of nostalgia and pain. "You shouldn't call it trash, Karen. It's my mother's portrait," he said softly but firmly, defending his mother's memory for the first time in years. Meanwhile, destiny continued weaving its threads. The housekeeper vacancy, left open after firing the previous employee, another victim of Karen's bad temper, needed urgent filling. By a coincidence that could only be Providence's work, the agency sent Rose Vargas's resume, who had been patiently waiting for such an opportunity. Maurice, reviewing the papers without much attention, approved the hire based on the excellent forged references Rose had obtained with friends' help. Thus, the woman holding the key to truth was about to cross the mansion's threshold again, this time from inside. Rose arrived 2 days after the painting incident, dressed in an impeccable uniform and with a humble, servile attitude, but with eyes attentive to every detail. Upon entering the main living room, she felt a shiver, recognizing the furniture, smell, and energy of the house Mrs. Mary had described so many times in her stories. "Welcome. I hope you're efficient and discreet. I don't like gossip or slowness," warned Karen in her first interview, without recognizing in that older woman the young one who had worked at the clinic years before. Rose nodded, lowering her head to hide the defiant gleam in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be a tomb." During her first days, Rose dedicated herself to cleaning and observing, earning Valerie's trust with cookies and stories and studying Maurice and Karen's schedules. It was while cleaning Maurice's study that she found a small photo of Mrs. Mary, half hidden behind some books, which he kept secretly. Upon seeing it, Rose had to sit a moment to catch her breath, kissing the image like a religious icon. "I'm here now, my lady. Don't worry, I've arrived," she whispered to the void. That afternoon, while Karen was at her massage session, Rose heard Valerie talking to herself in her room. The girl was telling her dolls about the grandmother from the painting. Rose entered with the excuse of bringing her snack and asked softly, "What grandmother are you talking about, little Valerie?" Valerie, trusting, told her about the attic find and how much she looked like her dad. Rose felt her heart pounding wildly. The portrait was there, accessible, the visual proof she needed to confront Maurice. She decided she couldn't wait any longer. The risk of Karen discovering her was high, and every passing day was another of suffering for Mary. She would wait for Maurice to be alone in that vulnerable moment he usually had in the afternoons by the piano. She went up to the attic stealthily, retrieved the painting, and brought it down wrapped in a sheet, hiding it in the pantry until the right moment. The final piece of the stage was ready. All that was left was the courage to light the fuse that would explode the lie. The decisive moment came one stormy afternoon, as if the weather wanted to close the dramatic cycle that had started with rain years before. Karen had gone out to a charity gala, leaving Maurice alone at home, sunk in his usual melancholy with a glass of brandy. Rose knew it was her golden opportunity. She adjusted her uniform, took the nacre rosary she kept in her pocket like a treasure, and headed to the main living room. Maurice looked up upon seeing her enter, surprised she hadn't retired to rest yet. "Do you need something, Rose?" he asked with distant kindness. "I need you to listen to me, Mr. Maurice, but not as your employee, but as a human being carrying a truth that belongs to you," said Rose with a firmness that made Maurice set his glass on the table. The woman took out the rosary and placed it on the glass surface. The sound of the beads clinking resonated like a gunshot in the room's silence. Maurice looked at the object and paled instantly. He would recognize it anywhere in the world. It was the rosary from his first communion, the one his mother always carried. "Where did you get this? Did you steal it?" asked Maurice, standing up with a mix of anger and confusion, visibly trembling. "No, sir. She gave it to me. Your mother, Mrs. Mary, in room 217 at St. Michael's Angel Clinic," replied Rose, without backing down from the employer's fury. "She gave it to me to deliver to you if I ever managed to find you, as proof she was still alive and waiting for her son." Maurice felt the world spinning around him. Rose's words were impossible, absurd, clashing against the reality of the death and funeral he had lived. "You're lying. My mother died 6 years ago. I buried her," shouted Maurice, grabbing his head with his hands, desperate. "You buried a box full of stones, sir, or a body that wasn't hers," retorted Rose softly but with brutal force. "I worked at that clinic. I cared for her. I talked to her months after she supposedly passed away. She wasn't crazy, sir. She was kidnapped by your wife and that corrupt doctor." Maurice fell to his knees in front of the sofa. The revelation's impact was too great to bear standing. Memories began crowding his mind. The closed casket, Karen's haste, no autopsy, Villalobos's refusal to let him see the body. Everything started making macabre and terrible sense. "Tell me everything. Don't hold back," he pleaded from the floor, looking at Rose like an oracle. And Rose spoke. She told him about the prayer nights, intercepted letters, Mary's lucidity, and her unbreakable love for him and Valerie. She described how they took her that rainy night, how they tricked her, and how the clinic staff was silenced with threats. Each of Rose's words was a brick, destroying Karen's wall of lies and building a ladder to hope. Maurice cried like a child, a wrenching cry releasing years of accumulated guilt and poorly processed grief. He realized his instinct had always been right, that the unease in his chest was his mother's voice calling from captivity. "Where is she now? Is she still alive?" he asked with a choked voice, fearing it was too late. "I don't know for sure, sir. They took her to a place called Street Lucia in the outskirts. But if God is just, she's still resisting because she's a woman of steel," replied Rose, offering her hand to help him up. In that moment, Maurice stopped being the defeated and manipulable man he had been for the last decade. A cold and calculated fury took over him. It wasn't just anger. It was a son's determination who had failed and had one last chance to redeem himself. "We're going to find her, Rose, and I swear on my life that those who did this will pay for every tear she shed," sentenced Maurice, clutching the rosary in his fist until his knuckles turned white. It was then Rose brought the attic painting and placed it before him. "Look at her, sir. She's the same woman I saw, the same gaze. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise ever again." Maurice caressed his mother's painted face, renewing the protection promise he had broken years ago. There were no more doubts, only a clear and urgent mission. The front door opened at that instant, and Karen's heels echoed in the foyer. She was returning from her party, drunk on champagne and arrogance, unaware she was entering the wolf's mouth. Maurice signaled Rose to stay by his side and turned toward the entrance, waiting for his wife with an expression that would make the devil himself tremble. The confrontation was imminent. Karen entered the living room humming a tune, took off her fur coat, and stopped short seeing Maurice standing with the rosary in hand and the employee beside him with a defiant look. The silence that followed was dense, electric. "What are you doing up? And what is this woman doing here at this hour?" asked Karen, sensing something was terribly wrong. Maurice didn't respond immediately, just stepped toward her, showing the rosary. "Hello, Karen. Mom sends greetings from the hell you condemned her to," said Maurice, with a voice so icy that Karen felt her blood freeze in her veins. Karen's face went from confusion to absolute terror in seconds. She tried to laugh, tried to play the indignation card, but Maurice's gaze disarmed her completely. "What are you talking about? You're drunk, Maurice. You're saying nonsense," she babbled, backing toward the door, seeking an instinctive escape route. "No, Karen. For the first time in years I'm completely sober and awake," he replied, advancing implacably. "I know about the clinic. I know about the empty casket. I know you paid Villalobos to kidnap my mother. Rose has told me everything." Karen looked at Rose with pure and visceral hate. "That servant is lying. She's a thief. She must want money," she screamed, losing the elegant composure that always characterized her. "The only thief here is you, who stole my mother from me and stole my life," exploded Maurice, throwing a glass against the wall that shattered, scaring Karen until she fell into an armchair. "Confess, where is she? If you tell me now, maybe I'll have mercy and not turn you into the police immediately." Cornered and seeing her web of lies destroyed, Karen broke, began crying, but not tears of remorse, but of frustration and self-pity. "I did it for us. She hated us, Maurice, and always meddled in everything. She wouldn't let me breathe. She wanted to turn you against me," she screamed hysterically, revealing her true selfish nature. "I just wanted her gone, to leave us in peace. The doctor said it would be easy, that she'd be well cared for." Her confession was the final proof Maurice needed, though hearing it from her lips hurt more than any physical wound. "Well cared for? You threw her in a hole to rot while you spent her money on dresses and parties," said Maurice with disgust, looking at her like an unrecognizable monster. "Tell me, where is Street Lucia? Tell me now," he demanded, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her. Karen, trembling and sobbing, gave the approximate address, a lost place in the countryside that Villalobos had mentioned once. Maurice released her with repulsion, as if touching her dirtied his hands. Go to your room and don't come out. Tomorrow you'll leave this house forever, and if you try to flee before the police arrive, I'll hunt you down to the ends of the earth," warned Maurice. Karen ran upstairs, locking herself in her room, knowing her reign was over and her luxurious life had vanished. Maurice didn't waste time. He called a trusted private detective, Richard Salgado, and asked him to assemble a team to go to Street Lucia that same night. He wouldn't trust the local police, who might be bought by Villalobos. He had to do this himself. Rose prepared coffee and some food for the trip, showing admirable strength. "I'm going with you, sir. She'll need a friendly face when we find her," she said, and Maurice nodded gratefully, recognizing that without this woman, his mother would still be lost. They left in the early morning under the ceaseless rain, driving at full speed on muddy back roads, guided by hope and desperation. In the car, Maurice called Villalobos, waking him. "I know everything, Ernest. I'm going for my mother. If you've touched a hair on her head, pray, because not even God will save you from me." He hung up before the doctor could respond, leaving him terrified. They arrived at Street Lucia residence at dawn. It was a grim place, a fortified old house with high walls and barking dogs in the yard. Detective Salgado and his men forced the entry, surprising the sleepy guards who didn't expect an armed incursion. Maurice ran in, shouting his mother's name, opening doors to rooms where elders lived in deplorable conditions, dirty and hungry. The place's reality was worse than imagined. It was a concentration camp for unwanted elders. Finally, in a room on the top floor, he found a padlocked door. The detective kicked it open. There, sitting in an old chair by the window, wrapped in ragged blankets, was Mrs. Mary. She turned slowly at the noise. Her eyes were tired and her body frail, but upon seeing Maurice, a light ignited in her gaze. "Maurice, is it you, my son?" she asked with a trembling voice, fearing she was dreaming. Maurice fell to his knees before her, hugging her legs, crying uncontrollably. "It's me, Mum. I came for you. Forgive me for taking so long. Forgive me." Mary stroked his head with her bony hands, smiling with infinite peace. "I knew you'd come, my boy. I never lost faith. Love always finds the way back." Rose entered behind, crying too, and Mary extended her hand. "Thank you, dear. Thank you for keeping your promise." In that embrace of three, the iron curtain that had separated them collapsed forever. The return to the Belmont mansion was an almost mystical event. The sun rose just as the car crossed the main gate, illuminating the facade as if the house itself celebrated its rightful owner's return. Karen had fled during the night, taking only what fit in a suitcase and leaving a note full of pathetic excuses that Maurice tore without reading. It didn't matter where she was. Justice would catch up eventually, but for now, the only thing that mattered was healing. The household staff, upon seeing Mrs. Mary get out of the car, froze. Some crossed themselves, believing they saw a ghost, but soon the shock gave way to joy and emotional tears. Valerie, awakened by the commotion, came down the stairs in pajamas, rubbing her eyes. She stopped upon seeing the elderly woman sitting in the main armchair, surrounded by her father and Rose. Maurice called his daughter softly. "Valerie, come here. I want to introduce you to someone very special. This is your grandmother, Mary, the woman from the painting." The girl approached slowly, looking in wonder at the woman who seemed to have stepped out of the painting into reality. Mary opened her arms, and Valerie, with children's pure intuition, ran to hug her without fear, feeling the warmth of blood recognizing each other. "Hello, my little princess. I've waited so long to hold you," whispered Mary, smelling her granddaughter's hair, feeling life returning everything stolen from her and more. The following days were of slow but beautiful reconstruction. Trusted doctors attended Mary, who regained weight and strength with astonishing speed, nourished by her family's love. Maurice didn't leave her side, playing the piano for hours for her, filling the house again with music that had been forbidden. The news of finding Mrs. Mary and the scandal of the clandestine clinic shook society. Dr. Villalobos was arrested trying to cross the border and confessed everything, implicating Karen and other accomplices. Dozens of elders in similar situations were discovered, and thanks to Maurice's intervention, all were rescued and their families contacted. But Maurice wanted to do more. Rescue wasn't enough. He wanted to ensure no one else suffered what his mother had. With Mary's blessing, Maurice used much of his fortune to create the Mary Belmont Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting elders from abandonment and providing free legal and medical assistance. The mansion, once a mausoleum of coldness, became the venue for charity events and a home full of laughter and movement. Rose was named operations director of the house, holding a place of honor in the family, no longer as a servant but as the loyal guardian who saved the lineage. A year later, a grand party was held in the garden to inaugurate the foundation. Mary, dressed elegantly and wearing her recovered gold necklace, played the piano with her son and granddaughter in a six-handed melody that made everyone present cry. She was more alive than ever, radiant, proving dignity can't be locked away or destroyed. Maurice took the microphone and looked at his mother with adoration. They taught me love can do anything, but it was my mother who taught me love also waits for everything, forgives everything. Karen was never found. It was said she lived hidden in some distant town under a false name, consumed by bitterness and poverty, her own punishment in life. But in the Belmont house, her name was no longer mentioned. There was no space for rancor, only gratitude. Valerie grew learning from her grandmother the strength of character and kindness, becoming a wonderful young woman who would continue the legacy. One quiet afternoon, Mary and Rose sat on the porch watching the sunset like two old friends who had survived war. "Was it worth it, Rose?" asked Mary, looking at the orange horizon. "Every second, ma'am, every second," replied Rose with a serene smile. The wind blew softly, bringing the scent of roses, and in that instant of perfect peace, Mrs. Mary closed her eyes and sighed, knowing finally and forever she was home. The Belmont story became a legend in the city, an eternal reminder that truth is like water. It always finds a crack to escape, and a mother's love is the universe's most powerful force, capable of defeating death itself. And so, amid music, laughter, and the certainty of being together, they lived their days not as a fairy tale happy ending, but as a glorious beginning of a true life. If this story has touched you, we'd appreciate it if you rated it from 1 to 10. Support us with a like and subscribe to our channel Tales of Kindness. Comment from where you're watching us. Thanks for your unconditional support in every story. Blessings to you and your family.